right, Dave. Let's talk about math. Yeah, let's do some math. But first of all, let's give some context of why it is that we want to talk about math. When so many people at the very mention of the word, like throw up their arms and be like, oh, no, math, it's the worst thing ever. I haven't done math since I was in middle school or whatever, right?
Unless you're an engineer. We know a few of those.
Yes. Obviously I am an engineer. I think very analytically. I personally like math. And not just because of the reasons that we're going to discuss this evening. I think math is beautiful. I think it is an excellent way to look at the world around you. And that being said, I will admit up front that not everything can be reduced to mathematics, right? I don't believe in determinism. I don't believe in reductionism. I don't think that everything can be fully explained by math, but a lot of things can.
A lot of things can.
And the things that can be explained by math, we should make the effort to have them be explained by math. But the things that can't necessarily be explained by math, which I would say human relationships actually is kind of a gray area between the two, but we can still learn from it. And as we've said multiple times, math is a model, right? Or modeling the world, the universe, or whatever, using math turns it into a model, and all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think that what we are going to discuss here is going to be one of those very useful things, right?
I agree. Looking forward to putting this together.
So what is the motivation behind this? I want to share a piece of the newsletter that came out recently from Rollo Tomasi's Substack. Rollo Tomasi, the author of The Rational Male. We think that he's one of the greatest strategic thinkers of the 21st century. And the way that he phrased some things in his recent newsletter about the human equation, the fact that he used the word equation at all, right? This idea of there being this mathematical equation or this equivalency or this formula that we are all trying to fill. The idea that we all want to survive, we all want to replicate. Well, the way that we survive is that we accumulate resources, and the way that we replicate is that we all have sex, right? I mean, no surprises there. So, but he's essentially answering the question, why is sex so important to all of us? But the fact that he would bring mathematical terms into the conversation about something as not mathematical, quote, not mathematical as a thing like sex, is really interesting to us.
I think the breakdown on this, because we had both read it and it was pretty powerful. And I know you're going to read it here in a moment, but we were able to break it apart a bit. And we really kind of want to do a dive on it of what this means to us and the importance of breaking this out as it means to us in the anthroponics domain, the breaking out and trying to look at physics and look at math as a model to help solve some sociosexual problems. And with that, man, send it.
Yeah. So this is the newsletter from Rollo Tomasi's Substack, The Human Equation. Link for this is in the description of the video. Highly recommend that you read the whole thing. It is short, but it is powerful. This one hits hard, I think. But the piece of it that we are going to focus on here is all the way down at the bottom here. Like literally his last paragraph, last couple of words, last couple of sentences here. Right here, I'm going to highlight it for all of us and we can read it together. He says, while we have the power to exercise our will over the equation, and you can read what he has to say about the equation, but there's that mathematical term. We can exercise our will over the equation. We are still subject to its rules. Our operative state doesn't change because we feel, italicized, emphasized, we feel like something about it should. Powerless people think that they can change the equation to better fit their deficit of ability to deal with it. Powerful people function within the equation and master it. Bro.
Yeah, this smacked.
This right here, it's the analogy that we talk about so frequently about power and influence and attraction being so similar to other laws of nature like gravity, right? Gravity doesn't care what you are feeling that day. Whether you are powerless or powerful against gravity makes no difference to gravity itself, right? Well, powerless people are going to be subject to the law of gravity to their detriment, right? They don't know how to use it to their benefit. But the powerful people, the influentials, they fully understand gravity for what it is, and they can use it to accomplish some really incredible things. Now, we don't actually know what gravity is, right? Like, we don't know if there are like little particles called gravitons that communicate out to everything, saying that this is how much gravity you and I share, or is gravity a wave? Or we don't know all of the fundamentals of gravity, but we know how it works.
So this is a discussion physicists have where they can't quite describe what gravity is. Like, there's a deeper dive and understanding of what exactly this is, but we can still use it. It still gets used. We still design rockets and spaceships that can land on Mars using the principles, the models for gravity. So,
well, what is the model? It's math.
It's a math equation.
It's a math equation.
So a couple threads we pull on here. We had, in our last discussion, talked about standing on the shoulders of giants. You don't have to have some deep PhD level understanding of a particular science to distill down the immediate applicable of things that have been learned within a particular science. And there was a time in history where human beings wandered the earth and never asked questions about why their feet never left the ground. And then Newton comes and he says the apple has a tendency to fall.
You're right.
And begins asking questions, and he writes Principia. And
yep, right here.
And coined the term. Newton came up with it himself, and you taught me this, that the word gravity didn't exist until he coined it.
So the Latin gravitas meant to be heavy, right? Like, prior to Newton, they knew about this idea of gravity, but nobody truly understood what gravity was, or gravitas, in terms of celestial motion and the planetary motion and how things interact, until Newton. It was Newton who pulled all of these ideas together. We owe all of our, not all, the foundation of our understanding of gravity, of innate attraction between entities, between massive objects, to Newton. That's where it began.
And we've taken a lot of Newton's principles and we've used them as a model and almost a homage to the way he mentally approached trying to solve for gravity and some physical observations that he was making. And this is why it's the mathematical principles of natural phenomenon.
Yeah.
And we are taking a homage to looking at human interactions as something to apply some math to for a better understanding, as though these models may be put out there and they may be wrong, but we are going to attempt to argue that they are useful.
Yeah. Essentially what we're doing here is following the same sort of steps that Newton did, right? The evolutionary epistemology, the way that he got to gravity is that he took all of these ideas from other folks, right? From the Ptolemaic geocentric view of the solar system, that everything rotated around the Earth, right? That Earth was the center of the universe, right? And that model, and it was a model, and it was very mathematical. I mean, they had it down to like the nth degree, very accurate model, even for how everything revolved around the Earth. But the way that they had to do it was completely false. Like, they were using what's called an epicycle, right? These additional, circles upon circles upon circles upon circles in order to get all of the planetary motion to line up. Thing is, well, if you have an infinite number of epicycles, yeah, you can model essentially anything.
And we've discussed that in mathematical principles, that if you dump enough numbers into something, you can make math do almost anything you want it to.
Yeah.
And
you can literally explain away anything with enough variables, with enough epicycles.
With enough epicycles. And this was before certain other scientists built on other principles in math and other observations to get a better understanding of what was happening outside. And we're talking about cosmology, science, and study of stars and orbits, physics, which are modeling our human interaction piece on. We have discussed that modern humans are, well, that's something interesting to say, because we're only living in modern times, but we are prehistoric creatures.
Yes.
Living in medieval
institutions
with godlike technology.
Yeah, exactly.
And we still dump epicycles into the understanding of what is it, in fact, that is going on around us. And we see a lot of emotional hysteria when someone or something, because we have discussed that the anthropogenic domain is at the individual level and also can behave at certain tiers above it. It become a group of people that will behave almost, like a person.
Well, because
the math is the same.
Math is the same at every level. At the individual, the math is the same. And then you bring more people together, and now you have a family unit or a small business environment, but you still have people, right? And people are going to interact as people do, because we are prehistoric creatures. And you can add additional layers of medieval institutions. You can even add godlike technology, but the math doesn't change, because we're still the same evolutionary product that has existed for 200,000 years.
Right. And we have taken notes and gotten to that point where the medieval human doing medieval things, wanting to survive and replicate, is almost the purest form of human interaction.
Yep.
Because the medieval constructs then become negotiations.
Right.
That some of them, we as a society need in order to keep good order and structure and keep anarchy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
if you want to bring some judgment into it, right, we can place our ideals upon the way that people interact at the individual level all the way up to the nation state level.
We had to satisfy certain Maslowian needs in order to develop civics and government and representation and, money and exchange. And then now beyond that, this understanding or misunderstanding of certain godlike technologies that now the sophisticated monkey is using in constructs that may or may not serve us, depending on how you want to look at these models that we're developing. It's very interesting.
And going back to the idea of the sophisticated monkey using these epicycles, we do have the ability to analyze and reason. Not everything is, completely instinctual. Not everything is completely emotional, right? We can filter these things through our orientation. We can recognize that the tropes and the advice and the things that we are giving, all these epicycles that are being added and added and added upon into our human interaction, we can realize that stuff is not actually working, right?
Right. It's a placeholder. Or to tear apart the quote, our operative state doesn't change because we feel like something should be.
Yeah.
Hence the feel is going to drive the epicycle. Powerless people think they can change the equation to better fit the deficit of their ability to deal with it or understand it.
Exactly. They're adding epicycles. That's them trying to change the equation. Add more and more and more, or even go the other direction and remove things, right? Saying things like, gender is just a social contract, right? I'm sorry, but no, gender is set by our biology as a product of evolution, right? Now, how that actually manifests, how gender operates within the anthropic domain, we can have a conversation about all those things, but gender itself is part of your human hardware, right? And so this idea that people can add to or remove from the equation in order to, as Rollo says, better fit their inability to operate within the anthropic domain, right? But on the other hand, you have people who have mastered the equation, people who become influential, who become powerful. They are not trying to change the equation at all.
They're honoring their observations.
Yeah.
And within those observations, or the math that equates, taking the emotional hysterics out of it, they're actually producing results.
Yeah. They're using the equation for gravity to put a rover on the moon, put people on the moon, or send one to Mars. Or, back in the 1970s, we built rockets that sent probes that are now outside of the solar system. Like, these masters of the math didn't try to change the math. They didn't try to add to or remove from, but they took what was available.
Or they learned from it, because we blew up a lot of rockets trying to get satellites in orbit.
And killed people, and as part of the space exploration program and the development of human flight, faster than sound flight or whatever, right? Yeah.
We had pointed to in our last discussion that certain principles or models have been derived that are written in blood in the anthropic domain. Is it as severe? And like, you can kind of clumsily go through life. And actually, I'll drop something we've talked about often. I don't know if we've coined this, but we certainly believe that there are men and women who will live their entire lives and die without ever asking themselves these questions, without having a conversation about why are we interacting the way that we're interacting. And they live their lives by the tropes or by the epicycle.
Yeah.
And it doesn't produce or yield the result that they want. And the blame, again, on the bad advice is that it's blamed on the operator. I just wasn't good enough. I didn't figure it out. I wasn't valuable enough.
Right.
Where you could have been if you were trained.
Yeah.
And if you understood the math. Then if you understood the math, you could have done something about it.
Right.
Your game plan, if you will, your map, the way that you navigated yourself could have yielded a more positive result on behalf of your own decision-making sovereignty, the things that you wanted to achieve.
What you're saying is that people could be better able to achieve their potential had they known the math. But here's the thing. People are going to still survive. They're still going to replicate even if they don't know the math, because people have been surviving and replicating for years.
So it's part of the biology, but we're on the outside observing it. We are observers of the whole domain, and most people can't figure it out, or they'll attribute it to something that's incorrect.
Yeah.
Or place a judgment hold on it and go, if you don't believe what I believe, you're bad. And we have broken that down as well, because you have a passage from
Robert Greene's 33 Strategies of War, that the origin of morality comes from trying to distinguish between the in-group and the out-group, the tribe and the other. Because we as humans are so good at pattern recognition, we use that to increase our ability to survive, right? And to replicate by identifying the things that are good for us, quote, good, right? Valuable,
okay,
right? And also comparing them, differentiating them against the things that do not help us to better survive or better replicate. And so the way that it became morality is that the things that help us to survive become good. Like we attach a moral judgment to it.
And this is where we've had discussions in some of our mentoring sessions where we almost attack the word integrity.
Yeah.
Because that is such a heavy word. Like, nobody wants to be accused of not having it. But it's at a real basic level, we've heard the definition of integrity be doing the right thing when no one's watching.
Yeah.
But doing the right...
What if the right thing actually hurts you?
Or doing the right thing according to who?
Right.
So we start replacing those words with, because this is going to hurt, right? This is going to smack. It's doing the right thing. Now take right thing and then replace some of the words of the judgment words, and it's doing the social norm thing when no one's watching. Doing the status quo thing, being programmable and behaving according to the tribe. And your tribe might be wrong.
Yeah.
It just very well might be wrong. And I've challenged folks who kind of want to heard this discussion on breaking the word integrity, is that, does your integrity have courage? Meaning, are you doing your right thing according to whatever moral compass it is that you're following, but do you have the courage to stand for the thing that you truly believe in whether it be the right or not right thing according to judgment.
Right.
Then we climb above that and go, well, what's the anthropronautic answer? Does it help you survive and replicate? Does it make you valuable? Does it make you powerful and influential?
Yeah.
And power and influence is completely moral-less.
It's amoral. Yeah. Or you can bring morality to it,
But it's secondary to,
but morality is secondary.
it's secondary to the technology. It's secondary to the math.
Yep.
It's secondary to this is why this quote smacked so hard.
Yeah.
Is that learning to maximize and operate within what is true to gravity. Because you can be mad at it, but if you take a good jump in the air, you ain't going to float.
Right.
Like, you have to adhere to certain unrefutable laws of physics. And there are certain unrefutable laws of human interaction that I truly don't believe we societally understand enough that it becomes part of our orientation to get the answer right most often.
Society's orientation, which is really just a summation of all of our very conditioned orientations up to this point, right? The society's orientation, or our orientation, speaking collectively, not about you and me specifically, is to think of our interactions in terms of all of these epicycles, that you need to be your best authentic self, right? Well, what if your self sucks? Right?
Just be yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, that feels so good. But
right.
if we mapped it out and your value's at a 4 out of 10, I'm essentially telling you just stay a 4.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not good advice. When it's said like that, like, you're a 3. And
but just be yourself.
Just be yourself.
Yourself is fine.
When I know in order to put points on the board and have any effect on life, you need to be an 8 or a 9.
Right, because evolutionarily speaking, nobody wants to get with the 3.
Right. And we can,
and it, both speaking in terms of replication, but also in terms of survival, the 3 is dragging the tribe down. Like, you're actually a liability to us.
Then why in these little tribal circles then does someone of higher value go to someone of lower value and say, just be yourself?
Because they've been conditioned, they've been taught bad math.
Right.
Right? They've had an epicycle and another epicycle added in, just like be authentic to yourself, or add in vulnerability is another epicycle, right? That the best thing that you can do as a leader, hold on, the best thing that you can do as a leader is be vulnerable. Well, what do predators do with vulnerable people? They take advantage of them, right? Well, I use the word predator, but really it's just that anybody who is in a in any sort of conflict or any sort of competitive environment is going to turn into a predator, right? A predator just being someone who's trying to take advantage of another entity's things. Yeah, what you have, I want. And so I'm going to take steps to get what you want.
I mean, do we fault the lion for eating the slowest gazelle? I mean, lions got to eat.
Lions got to eat.
Lions were bred to hunt and eat. And there's no emotional hysteria that's going to make the lion less hungry.
Yeah, exactly. But
poor gazelle. Gazelle should have ran faster.
If the gazelle comes out to the lion and says, I'm going to be vulnerable here for a moment.
I really got to eat. Can we negotiate? I'll just take half a leg today. And it defies the laws of survival and replication.
Yeah, it adds these epicycles on top of the already bad math. It's not that it was inaccurate, it's that it was not a true depiction of what was actually happening. And it left out some really important, rather simple relationships that from the math that help us to understand truly how things interact. And so, for example, the Ptolemaic geocentric model gave way to the Copernican system, which was heliocentric, put the sun at the middle. Well, that hurt a lot of people's feelings, right? If you look back at history, people who had to put their moral attachments on this geocentric way of looking at the universe were really offended by now changing our focus from Earth as the center to the sun as the center, right? But it was better math. It actually helped us, and it was simpler, right? The Copernican system eventually still had to add in some epicycles in order to make the predictions, the predictive capacity of the model to actually be useful. But it got us closer to what we now know as the way things actually work, right? It went from Copernicus to Kepler's laws of planetary motion, and then Newton, being the genius that he was, took all of these things together, and he came up with a very, very simple way of explaining gravity in terms of just a few variables with no epicycles at all. And even he, as accurate as it was, pissed off a lot of people, hurt a lot of feelings, right? But over the course of a rather short time, 50 years or so, that became the dominant way of understanding celestial motion. And not just that, but also like how movement here on Earth, how forces of mass interact here on Earth, right? Well, put that back now in the anthropic domain. What we are doing here, relying on those very similar ideas, it helps us to greatly simplify our interactions, that we don't even have to worry about words like authenticity or vulnerability, because it's not even in the math at all. What we are presenting is actually something that you can use. It has a prescriptive ability for people who can master it. But at the same time, it's also going to hurt a lot of feelings.
Yeah. And it's a model we're going to put out there like any scientist. So we have a hypothesis, and we'll put it out to people to just use the equation. If it works, and if it doesn't work, then attack it. That there was a time where Einstein, and I love this story, where a book was published. There's 100 scientists against Einstein, and Einstein's reply, if I was wrong, it would have only taken one of you.
Yep.
So we'll put it out to the world and see if it could be challenged. And that's awesome, because if it is and we're wrong, then educate me. I really want to see, because I'm just trying to figure this out with a different approach. I wanted to come to the word orientation because we use it quite often.
Okay.
And I think for those watching, the origins of the use of the word orientation should be given to Boyd's OODA loop model, which you and I want to break down into some detail here soon for episodes that we would like to do, because it is if it is not fundamentally understood, at least the way that you and I are breaking it down for the anthroponautic math, a lot is kind of lost. It is a model that has to be understood. In the beginning, you understand it, but it needs to be mastered.
Yeah.
You know, where you are in that particular model, John Boyd's OODA loop, to put equations through to start problem solving.
Yeah.
And orientation is the second O in the OODA loop, where orientation is everything that's going on in your nugget that you...
Let's define it here. So orientation is a set of components inherent to each human that combine to form the self, right? So everything that you are, your body, your brain, your consciousness, as well as all of your, like, who you are culturally, like the way that you were raised, the level of education that you have, your lived experience, all of these things combine in order to create this orientation that you receive information and you filter through that orientation before you pass that on to the decision, and then you act on that information. Once you act, then it is out into the real world again, and you see what are the results of your actions, and then it comes back again to the observation, filtered into your orientation, decide, act. Then therein is your quintessential OODA loop.
Well, that is the loop. That's the process in which you see things. Your orientation, just like you described, creates decisions, and when acted upon, begins to put math into the world. creates gradients, which we will also discuss.
But the orientation itself is mathematical.
Yes.
Right.
And the connections, the immediate nexus that is made when teaching the OODA loop to those who may have had some training in it before, either from a military background or law enforcement background or just a business model background. Because I've had this taught and I've seen it taught in business leadership courses, and the military law enforcement world teaches it almost like a scheme of maneuver, where like it's this thing you physically do.
Yeah, that the orientation is like, I am turning my body.
Right. And it's so limited. And the OODA loop is very rich. And if you understand it, that model in and of itself, that algorithm that you'd put it through, helps you to arrive. Well, that's the whole point. That's why John Boyd developed it, was to outthink, to outmaneuver your adversary, which was coined the term maneuver warfare.
Yeah. The OODA loop as a whole, but the orientation being the most important aspect of the OODA loop, enables maneuver, right?
Yes.
And part of the math that we can discuss here is that the orientation actually carries inertia. That the way that you see and interact with the world actually pushes you in a particular direction. Just as a ball rolling down the hill carries inertia in that particular direction. And it takes an outside force to change the direction that ball will roll. Well, I, as an individual, I'm going to go the way that I see is best for my own survival and replication. And then once I'm taken care of, then I can start worrying about the people around me. I can worry about the tribe, right? Well, I'm going to go in that direction that is best for me and for my survival and replication until I am acted upon by some other force. Now, I call those anthropedal forces, influence and attraction, right? And we can math those out just as well as we can the rest of this, right? Well, that influence or that attraction is going to come from somebody else's orientation, right? That comes from the human interaction. You, using your orientation, are going to push or pull. You're going to influence or attract my orientation. You're going to make my inertia move, right? Or change direction in some sort of way. Well, now we're, again, just starting to model celestial motion, but now it's in terms of people. Well, if we're modeling motion, we're right back to Newton again. And we're right back to math. You can't get away from it.
No, and this model, it explains things in a different way, and it's immediately applicable.
If you understand the math. It's applicable if you understand the math. If you don't understand the math, then you are an entity that to be acted upon. My orientation that understands the math is going to act on your orientation that doesn't. And so you're going to be subject to my will, my frame, my desires, as opposed to your own.
And we covered on our 2-tier model, untrained and not valuable, like no value to the tribe, and you don't understand the math, and you are not trained. You are invisible.
Yeah.
And then you are to be acted upon.
Well, in tribal environment, like think 200,000 years ago at the inception of our species, the invisibles, where do they end up? Kicked out of the tribe. Or at least...
Or slave labored.
Or slave labored, right? Acted upon in some form or fashion that was the will or the desire or the necessity of those who were of higher value and better training. So if you don't want to be invisible, it behooves you to increase your value and increase your training. But both of those require that you understand the math.
And also requires the willingness to do something about it. Hence the decision and action piece of the OODA loop.
Yes. It's all connected here.
the breakdown of this quote, powerless. And I love that he uses that word, just calls it out. Powerless. That's invisible or ineffective or incompetent.
Any combination of the three.
Think they can change the equation to better fit their deficit of the ability to deal with it.
They would rather change the math than understand the math and become masters of it.
And then powerful, power and influence, forces. Powerful people function within the equation and master it.
Yeah. So you do need to understand the theory behind it, right? How did we get here? What are the things that we are pulling together to have these discussions, right? That's the evolutionary epistemology, right? Epistemology being knowledge, evolution being how did you get from point A to point B? The evolutionary epistemology of anthroponautics borrows very heavily from physics and from other types of math. I'm actually going to share a quote from Principia. So here we are, Principia. This is the foreword written by Edmund Halley, or Halley, namesake of Halley's Comet. The things that so often vex the minds of the ancient philosophers and fruitlessly disturb the schools with noisy debate. By the way, here on Rollo's article, he talks about how for so long, mapping all of this, mapping human meaning and existentialism onto biological and empirical realities is something even the greatest philosophers fail at. Okay? He's calling out the philosophers as being incapable of figuring all this out. Well, let's go back to Principia. The things that so often vex the minds of the ancient philosophers and fruitlessly disturb the schools with noisy debate, we see right before our eyes, since mathematics drives away the cloud. Error and doubt no longer encumber us with mist, for the keenness of sublime intelligence has made it possible for us to enter the dwellings of the gods above and to climb the heights of heaven. Math makes it possible for us to do all of these things, to move beyond these ancient philosophers who have struggled, ancient and modern, I would say, struggled to identify what is this thing called leadership, right? It's not real. It never was real. So we need to move beyond this fruitless debate over what leadership or followership or authenticity or any of those things are, and focus on the math, because the math is what is going to help drive away the cloud of doubt, of error, and help us to do things like landing a rover on Mars from an anthropic perspective.
I want to take a shot at defining leadership. I'm going to rap about this for a minute and see if we can land on something, because the conversation that we had to deal with today professionally, I ended up using the term airmanship as something that came out of the, aeronautics, and that an operator, a pilot, would have to show airmanship skills, which in that realm really just meant judgment, good judgment.
Yeah.
And what's good judgment is making decisions that you can survive. So you could survive the flight and get the mission accomplished, whether it's getting from point A to point B, or it's in a military sense, doing an operation, flying an operation where you go have an effect on target and you come home safely. Doing things with discipline and precision. You know, my love for reading the samurai literature.
Yeah.
And the Bushido principles. And one of those is rectitude, which is prudence and understanding when it was the right time to fight and when it was the right time to keep your sword sheathed.
Right.
That prudence and judgment. Could leadership be not the title and really not the achievement, but in and of itself maybe just be a principle that is something along the lines of whoever has the power and influence shows good judgment.
Yeah.
Now We're entering that into place.
Yep.
That is secondary to the maintaining power and influence. Because without it, you can't lead. Maybe we could play with those concepts. I can't think of anything, certainly off the top of my head, and in history and study and my professional experiences, that someone was holding the helm that weren't meeting the mathematical principles of anthroponautics in order to do what they did as a leader effectively.
Yeah.
So, well, leadership is a sub category, or maybe it's this principle that needs to be defined. But as it's defined, certainly out in the world right now, we want to fight and debate and argue that leadership, the way that it is taught, is wrong. It's absolutely a subcategory to something that is amoral.
Yeah. So I'm going to take it back to gravity again, because it's such an effective, amoral, no judgment way to talk about these things. So which leads the other, the sun or the earth? Which leads the other, the earth or the moon? Like,
what period of time? Now we're going to enter judgment into it, because you'd ask someone that maybe was somewhat switched on in an older yesteryear time of history, and you would have a debate about it, and you'd be the village idiot to think that the sun didn't revolve around the earth.
I mean, which is telling the other to orbit? Like,
I mean, we now know the answer to that. It's only because I'm a dude who lives in the year 2023 that we orbit the sun. And now the person who thinks that the earth is flat is the village idiot.
Right. Which was for so long the approved, like doctrinally approved way to think about the world.
Right.
The universe even. But it's even more than just understanding that the earth orbits the sun. It's understanding that they are in a relationship with each other, that because of Newton and his ability to describe so succinctly, so simply, that one force is going to have its equal and its opposite, right? Just as much as the sun pulls on the earth pulls on the sun. And there is no leader between them.
It's only influence.
It's only influence between them. Right?
That keeps them in their orbit.
That keeps them in the orbit that as they are currently defined.
Now, I'm going to feather this in our fascinating discussions, and I'm looking at the book Friends by Robin Dunbar.
Yeah.
And when we draw out these layers of
orbits,
they look like orbits when we've drawn them up, drawing these circles, and they look like planetary orbits or satellite orbits.
Yeah.
And then we also look at it and we look at the nucleus of an atom and go, one electron can only stay in this.
An orbital. It's not an exact orbit, but it's actually probably the atom is probably a better representation of humans and how we interact than celestial mechanics.
So that when we draw them up, we've looked at it and we have attempted to discuss that one electron can only stay in this one orbit, and if it needs to be moved, it releases energy. And what is that? What is that to the anthropic domain?
Yeah.
Which is a fascinating discussion as well. And the witnesses that we've had sit down just as we're trying to figure things out are just like, right? Because you could see it in your everyday life. Just imagine that we draw it like you were here, like you were the center of this, and then we begin to do the rings out. But we understand these tight orbits are due to the density of value that you assign or you attract based on your own numerical number of value. And those numerics are placed on you by other humans. It just begins to make sense. And the behavioral exchanges between people that you love, care about, and value, or in working type relationships with, or nation state relationships, it makes sense. And it makes sense because there is numbers that we can apply to attempting to solve the behavior between people,
Yeah.
organizations, nation states,
Math.
math.
It is best understood in terms of math.
And we want to frame a majority of our discussions just looking at it from mathematical principles, as we've discussed, because then it takes the judgment out of it. And then it can be immediately identified if somebody, hey, please, like, let's have a discussion about this because I want to learn. Like, let's really try to figure this out.
Right.
And then can we identify a counter argument as emotional hysteria? Like, then just show me in the math where you want to say that this is or is not working because you're wrong. Well, that's judgment. Give me a number.
Yeah.
Like,
you show me more correct math. Show me where I've included too many epicycles, or my variable over on the left side doesn't match up the variables on the right side, right? Show me where I'm wrong.
Is this a good time to just line up in the part of the emotional hysteric debate is just a name call with maybe a $10 word or some psychology level label that, like, Machiavellianism,
right?
Is like, we just recently read The Prince.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, that's a work that gets a lot of judgment.
Yeah, it does.
Right. And it's that in that term alone is considered like a dark triad personality trait, right?
Yeah, but what if Machiavellianism helps you to better survive? And by the way, women really like dark triad traits in men. And so if a man has Machiavellianism in it, he's probably going to replicate more.
I mean, is there judgment in it if it continues to manifest itself in reality?
Right?
Like,
if it works, like if the math helps you to put, airplanes into the sky or satellites into space or rovers on another planet, then why are we saying that it's a bad thing?
I mean, dude, rockets defy gravity, but they do with a lot of force.
They don't actually defy gravity. They use gravity to their benefit.
But to the untrained observer, the apple falls up, and that shit ain't supposed to go down like that.
Right.
The
apple has a tendency to fly.
This doesn't make any sense, man. Until you come over and go, oh, well, there's a lot of rocket fuel, and when it gets ignited, it pushes against the equals opposite forces, and
yeah.
Oh, okay, well, that makes sense. But with that said, when you see valuable, trained people defy the laws of anthropogenic physics and do things that you can't do because you're invisible and untrained.
No, it's not that people who are influential, who have high value and are trained, defy anthropogenics. No. They defy old order thinking. They defy all of the incorrect ways of defining human relationships.
Well, we've studied it, so we tried to see that for what it is. But to the untrained observer, it looks like magic,
yes,
which is unexplained, or it looks like alchemy, which you did this out of nothing. But there's math. Let me show you the math.
It's when you went to see the people in, was it Honduras or something, and you flew a helicopter over them, and they're like, how do you keep the helicopter in the sky, right?
Right. Like, how does that...
It was magic to them.
Well, I totally want to go back in time and sit down with Da Vinci, and I see his drawing, and they put a Black Hawk helicopter next to it, and he'd just be like... In my mind, and playing with this idea, I think he'd be like, I knew it. Because wasn't he... I mean, he studied principles in physics and science, and I think he would hold up his model and hold up the other and be like, this absolutely makes sense. I knew it. I knew one day this would be real.
Yeah. But the technology hadn't caught up to the point where where that sort of thing could be put into reality. But that didn't mean that it was wrong. Right?
So then, curious question for the things that we are developing, right? Because we're trying to look out into the future. Where does this math go?
Well, these powerful people master the equation, right? And use it. How did Rollo say it exactly, right? He said that powerful people function within the equation and master it. They use it to accomplish their goals. They secure their sovereignty. They create options for themselves. And if they are benevolent, where we bring in that judgment, right? Bring in the morality, they will use their mastery of the math to benefit the people around them, to help the tribe, they're going to help themselves first, right? Everybody will. Anybody who masters these equations, by definition, will have helped themselves first. But if they are benevolent, if they are a, quote, good person who cares about society, cares about their family, their friends, their community, all the way up to the nation state level, they will use their mastery to help other people better survive, better replicate, right? And that would be our goal, right? Is that we are sharing this information, our understanding of the math, of the mathematical principles of the anthropic domain, right? So that other people can use it to secure their sovereignty. But we have to be fully cognizant of the fact that there are going to be people who are not benevolent, who are going to use these exact same principles, this exact same math for nefarious purposes. People can take the principles that Newton put together to create weapons that destroy lives. The gun is not the problem. The missile is not the problem. It's the person who is pulling the trigger, that they are using these tools to hurt other people. That is exactly the same as it is for the math of the anthropic domain, that you can use it to help or you can use it to injure. Now, you and I would hope that people would use it to help.
But that's secondary to the technology.
But that is secondary to the technology of the math.
So we have brought that up in the use of this word of technology being secondary to morality, even down to the basics. These are the things that we take for granted. Like the last thing a fish would notice is water.
Yeah.
It's the last thing that you're going to notice as a fish is that you're surrounded. And the last thing we notice is things that we take for granted. Just our use of language is a form of technology.
Mm-hmm.
And how much information which we have also mathed, that information is energy and it has value.
Yeah.
And we exchange it using vocals and
constantly.
And words matter and they carry emotion and they carry meaning. And we put them through our orientation and we make decisions and we act on them.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a sophisticated adaptation of grunting.
Yeah.
And in the super future, when we're hive-minded and we just look at each other and we telepathically communicate, we can't do it now. Or maybe we can. I don't know. Somebody out there that...
I'm married to a twin, and I tell you, the telepathy is real.
I believe that. Ever had somebody give you a call after, hey, I was just thinking about you?
Mm-hmm.
Every single person has had that happen. So like that's...
Yeah, and if you want to math that one, we can get into the idea of like quantum entanglement, and that, you know, the particle that's with me is also with you, and the change in one instantaneously changes the other. Yes. And that is not at all woo-woo. That is real. That is quantum physics.
So this is more math described. Now, as we digress, but in the future, there may be different ways to communicate, and we wouldn't, in that future, it's not so wild that this is in fact the way that we use something in order to exchange ideas or to pass energy, information.
Yeah.
These devices that we use. I mean, Elon Musk was talking about, we're already cyborgs. It's just this thing's external to us.
Yeah. The singularity is near, right here. It's going to happen. We are going to merge with our technology, and we will see, because the technology will allow us to physically see, like the observation phase of the OODA loop, right? We will see that the math is real. Like we will see it happen.
And that's going to be amazing. And I believe these things that we are developing, I mean, will be present. They'll be more present in those examples. But if we could take it left the line and look at the prehistoric, now sophisticated monkey, I mean, could we sit back knowing what we know and watch, a group of early man sitting around a campfire, breaking bread and sharing a meal, that tribal strong men had to go out and beat a woolly mammoth to death and then bring it back to a tribe to cut and butcher and cook and prep and coming together as a community physically
Right.
And you were the one who introduced me to a few books about the importance of community and bonding over movement.
Yep.
It was one of your favorite books.
Yeah. Keeping Together in Time by William McNeill. Yep.
That is about, it's about movement and bonding.
Yeah. The synchronization of movement. Yep. Is the synchronization of the tribe. Yep.
And where did we get that from? Why is that so important to us as an animal?
Evolutionarily speaking, it increases our ability to survive and replicate. It all comes back to that.
Right. And what are we not doing so much now? We don't move together, but the short times that we do are things that are Maslowian needs: breaking bread, sharing, communicating.
Yeah.
The socio-sexual connections that we make that look like layers of an atom.
Yeah.
And these connections it's all physics and it's math.
Yeah. It actually is all physics and it is all math. That's not to say, like, going all the way back to what I was saying at the beginning of our discussion here, is that doesn't make it deterministic. That doesn't make it reductionist. That just means that the math is actually very good at helping us to describe and predict the world around us. Here's the interesting thing about, so like, to an extent, Newtonian physics is extremely deterministic. But when you take it to the extreme, especially in the quantum world, Newtonian physics completely breaks down and it becomes meaningless. And it actually all becomes somewhat random, right? That you can't possibly make it be deterministic. But bringing it back to the anthropic domain and human relationships, we have this really interesting thing that doesn't exist in the rest of the universe, which is called choice, right? We have the ability to choose whether we are actually going to follow along what the math says, right? The math tells me that I should be influenced by the tribal leaders, but I have the ability to say within myself, actually, no, I don't want to do that. I'm going to choose to do something different. Choice, as accurate and useful as the math is for the anthropic domain, choice, human choice, can completely negate all of it.
I want to quote Viktor Frankl, the author of A Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
Gentleman was a psychiatrist, a practicing doctor of psychiatry before him and his family got taken to an internment camp.
Yeah.
He survived Auschwitz. So this is a dude who was a doctor of psychology.
Yeah.
So think about his orientation.
Right.
And what he knew and he practiced and how he understood people and psychology, and watching and observing and going through this horrific experience and surviving it, only to go on to write a 2-part book. Well, the book is 2 parts.
Yeah.
And his first part he wrote in like the first 6 days, I believe. He just brain dumped his experience of surviving the Holocaust. And then the second part of his book was his interpretation of the experience and his approach to therapy called logopsychology. But one of the most powerful quotes that come out of the book is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And that is something that, I mean, that sticks with me. That's pretty powerful. That's that nobody can make you do anything.
Yeah.
Because it has to affect something has to be powerful enough to affect and push past your orientation to immediately create a decision and an action.
Yeah.
And we can show where this is, one, in the OODA loop, and we can also show where it is in the anthropic math.
Right.
Because we just kind of hit on it earlier that in order for you to act, to decide and act, you'd have to be acted upon by
some external anthropedal force.
Right. And if you're not strong enough to, or you haven't practiced, I mean, it's like any kind of strength or muscle memory, like an immediate stimulus response, which is in the OODA loop.
Yep.
If you haven't trained or inoculated yourself to those forces, then you're going to be taken.
Yeah.
And not only is it just a trope and some leadership, hit the not really some leadership trope, right? Or like some the woo woo, like, well, you're strong enough to, sure, it's strength, but it's also in the math.
Yeah.
And if you understand the math, then you can build up some resiliency, which is another word that gets beat to death.
Yes, another epicycle.
That, do you think a 30-minute presentation on resiliency is going to make you immune to depression?
Right.
To make you I went through my resiliency thing. I'm never going to be sad again.
Exactly.
Like no breakup is ever going to, no divorce is ever going to cause people to walk off bridges anymore because you've
been resiliency trained.
Right. Or somebody who's a practitioner of, this is terrible because what I'm about to say is going to attack a whole group of professionals that sit down on couches and try to tell people how to feel. But ultimately it's within your own orientation has to make a willingness decision of how you're going to respond to a stimulus. But if you don't have the proper amount, and this is now met, like, I don't know what number to put on this, but if you don't have the right amount of strength to push against the forces,
the
anthropedal forces, then you're going to be taken. You are acted upon.
Yes. One thing I feel like I need to clarify there, I'm not disagreeing with you. You said orientation, and let's remember that the orientation is the combination of everything that makes up the self. So
Yes.
that is the body, that is the brain, that is the spirit, if you believe in it, right? Your cultural experiences, your education, your resources, all those things combine to make you, right? And let's acknowledge the fact that sometimes, like, the hardware aspect of your orientation, your body, your brain, your hormones, all those things can be like compromised. Yeah. The machine can get broken.
Or it can get caught in a logic loop.
Yes, exactly. And so, like, if somebody is full on in a depressive mode, right? No amount of telling them to just be happy, right? Just get over yourself or whatever. That's not going to work, right? You're going to need some other external input in the form of, like, I don't know, medication or exercise or something to help people fix the hardware, which is going to corrupt the firmware and the software. And it can go the other direction, right? That the software can corrupt the hardware. So I just want to acknowledge that up front, that it's not just a matter of saying, well, you just got to be willing. There are some other variables to
I would agree.
of this.
It gets deeper than.
But you're still right that if, for whatever reason, hardware issue, firmware issue, software issue, you don't have enough strength, enough willingness, enough whatever the unit of action is to start some sort of movement to get your orientation moving in another direction, then it's not going to happen. Make sense?
Acted upon by greater force.
Yeah. And as long as you continue to be compromised in whatever form or fashion, then you are in a position to be acted upon as opposed to act on others or act out, to enact your will on the world around you. I really liked what Viktor Frankl's the space between stimulus and response is choice. And I needed to account for that when I was developing the laws of human motion, of human mechanics, human relationships, right? Modeled off of Newton's laws, right? His first law is that an object in motion will stay in motion, right? That's just describing inertia, right? His second law being that the force of an object is going to be proportional to its mass and its acceleration, or vice versa. Acceleration is inversely proportional to the force that is acted on it, right? Law 3 is what we were describing earlier, the equal and opposite forces, but that's where Newton stops. He stops with those three right there. Well, those same kinds of laws apply to human interaction, that, as we've been saying, law 1 being that a person's orientation, their motion will stay in motion until they're acted on by somebody else, right? That's law 1 of Newton's laws for human interaction, right? Law 2 being that the amount of force that it takes to get you to change is proportional to your value. What is the value of your orientation? Because a highly value individual is not going to respond hardly at all to a very small force from an invisible individual, right? It takes a much greater force to get somebody of very high value to change the direction that they're headed. Makes sense? Yeah. Law 3, that just as the sun pulls on the earth pulls on the sun, equal and opposite reactions. I can't go through life influencing other people without being influenced by them. Now, the proportion of their influence on me is going to be very different. Just like the earth isn't pulling the sun around it, but there's still some amount of influence that is shared between them. Okay. So those are the 3 laws of human motion, human interaction. But I had to add a 4th one because of Viktor Frankl, because of this idea of choice. And I'm going to read it to you verbatim. Every human can choose to follow or disregard these laws. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Taking it back to Rollo Tomassi now, where we started this whole thing. Powerful people function within the equation and master it. Within that space between stimulus and response is our ability to grow and our freedom.
To secure your own sovereignty.
To secure your own sovereignty, to develop options for yourself, and then hopefully you're a benevolent person, and then you are going to use that choice and your mastery over the math, your high value, your training, to help other people follow in your footsteps, whether it's your biological children, your adopted children, or the people that you just choose to be as your family or your friends. You are going to replicate yourself in them. You help them to survive, and then you replicate yourself in them, and you hope that they do the same for others. And you perpetuate your legacy that way. That's what the math is for. That's why we are here, helping people to understand the math of the anthropic domain and how to anthroponic their way through human relationships. I think that's a good place to end it. If you know,
I'm good, man. That was good. Mic drop.
All right. Well, there's so much more that we could do. I mean, we actually didn't even show the math. We'll have to do that another time.
Oh, that's good. We're just rapping about these concepts that we're putting together. And then there was a term for it that in developing like a video series, what do we call this? A
pod class.
Pod class.
Pod class. Yes. Welcome to the pod class.
Which Steven's going to help us develop, because right now this is just content creation. We got to figure out how we're going to teach it as opposed to just discussing the ideas. So
yeah, stick around. We will actually write out the math and explain all the different laws, how laws of physics and everything help us to understand the mathematical principles of the anthropic domain. Yeah. So we'll leave it there. Peace. This has been a production of Anthroponautics, owned and operated by Slade Enterprises. Everything has been copyrighted, so don't steal our stuff.